Colorado Territory, autumn 1883. Catherine Wells arrived as a mail-order bride to rancher James Thornton, carrying nothing but a worn carpet bag and shadows she wouldn't speak of. Her haunted eyes and careful movements told stories her mouth refused to share. Instead of demanding answers, James offered something revolutionary for the frontier: patience. "I won't ask until you're ready," he promised, though curiosity burned in every quiet glance. What unfolded became a testament to how trust is built not through interrogation, but through the steady accumulation of days where safety proves itself real. Chapter 1. The Arrival Without Questions. The stagecoach rattled into Silver Pine Valley on October 3rd, bringing autumn wind and one passenger who clutched her carpet bag like a lifeline. Catherine Wells descended with deliberate care, scanning the depot as though expecting danger from every shadow. Her dress was clean but threadbare, her face carefully neutral despite the tremor in her hands. James Thornton waited near the hitching post, hat in hand, watching this woman who had answered his advertisement with letters so brief they revealed almost nothing. She was younger than he expected, perhaps 25, with dark hair pulled severely back and eyes that had seen too much. When he stepped forward to introduce himself, she flinched backward before catching herself. The reaction told him everything and nothing at once. James kept his distance, speaking in measured tones while explaining the wagon waited nearby. Catherine nodded without speaking, following several paces behind as they walked through town. She studied every face they passed, tension radiating from her narrow shoulders. The ranch sat 15 miles from town, tucked against the foothills where pine trees stood thick and protective. The 2-hour journey passed in careful silence. James pointed out landmarks without requiring response. The creek where trout ran thick in spring, the meadow where elk grazed at dawn, the ridge that marked his property line. Catherine watched it all with wary attention, her hands gripping the seat edge whenever the wagon jolted over rough ground. When a rabbit burst from the underbrush, she gasped sharply, pressing one hand to her chest. James pretended not to notice, keeping his eyes on the trail ahead. The house appeared modest but solid, logs chinked tight against winter, a stone chimney rising from the center, glass windows that caught afternoon light. A barn stood nearby with a small chicken coop and vegetable gardens gone autumn brown. Everything spoke of a man living alone, but keeping order nonetheless. James helped her down with careful distance, not touching more than necessary. He showed her the main room with its sturdy furniture and iron stove, the loft where he slept, and the small bedroom he had prepared for her use. Clean quilts covered the narrow bed. A wash basin sat on a simple table beside a window overlooking the valley. Catherine stood in the doorway, surveying this space that would become hers. For the first time, something eased in her expression, not quite relief, but perhaps the beginning of it. James explained the daily routine without expectation. She could join him for meals or eat separately as she preferred. The ranch required work, but he wouldn't demand more than she felt capable of giving. Then he delivered the promise that would define everything between them. He wouldn't ask about her past, wouldn't press for explanations, wouldn't demand more than she chose to share. When she was ready, if she was ever ready, he would listen. Until then, she could simply exist here without interrogation. Catherine's eyes widened slightly, searching his face for deception. Finding only sincerity, she nodded once, the gesture sharp with relief she couldn't quite hide. James tipped his hat and returned to the barn, leaving her alone to absorb this unexpected sanctuary. That night, Catherine unpacked her meager belongings with shaking hands. 3 dresses, a hairbrush, some personal items wrapped carefully in cloth. No photographs, no letters, nothing that spoke of family or origin. She sat on the bed's edge, listening to wind move through pines and footsteps on the porch as James checked the evening chores. Supper had been awkward, but not unkind. James cooked simple fare, beans, cornbread, dried venison, and ate quietly while Catherine picked at her food. He didn't comment on her poor appetite, didn't question the dark circles beneath her eyes, didn't remark on how she positioned herself with clear views of both doors. When exhaustion finally claimed her, Catherine lay rigid under clean quilts, waiting for danger that didn't arrive. The house remained quiet except for settling boards and distant owl calls. Somewhere below, James moved through his evening routine with predictable rhythm. No shouting, no heavy footfalls, no threats carried on whiskey breath. Perhaps, she thought before sleep claimed her, this strange arrangement might actually work. Chapter 2. The Language of Patience. The first weeks established patterns that gradually became routines. Catherine woke before dawn from nightmares she wouldn't name, finding James already in the barn tending animals. She learned to make coffee the way he liked it, strong enough to strip paint, and he learned she preferred hers with honey when available. James demonstrated trustworthiness through consistent actions rather than declarations. When Catherine screamed in her sleep, thrashing against invisible threats, he called through the door to check if she needed anything but never entered uninvited. When she refused his suggestion to visit town for supplies, he simply nodded and went alone. When horses approached the property and she froze mid-task, face draining of color, he calmly explained it was just the neighbor returning borrowed tools. Catherine began participating more in ranch life as days accumulated without incident. She discovered satisfaction in tending the garden's winter preparations, finding peace in the simple logic of composting and mulching. The chickens required daily attention, and she appreciated their uncomplicated needs: food, water, protection from predators. They asked nothing more complicated than consistency. Her cooking improved through trial and observation. James never criticized failed attempts, simply ate what she prepared with genuine appreciation. When she finally produced bread that rose properly and stew that didn't burn, his quiet praise felt earned rather than patronizing. Small moments of connection emerged like wildflowers pushing through hard ground. Shared coffee on the porch at sunrise, neither feeling obligated to fill silence with meaningless chatter. Working side by side to repair fence posts, their movements developing unconscious coordination. Evening hours spent near the fire, James reading old newspapers while Catherine mended clothes, both simply existing in comfortable proximity. James proved himself through restraint as much as action. He never entered her room, never stood too close, never made sudden movements that might startle. When she served supper, he thanked her with the same courteous tone he'd use with any guest. When she asked questions about ranch work, he answered thoroughly without condescension. The nightmares continued, though less frequently. Catherine still jumped at unexpected sounds and maintained clear paths to exits. But gradually, infinitesimally, the tension in her shoulders began easing. Her rare smiles came more naturally. She stopped watching the horizon quite so obsessively. One morning, Catherine mentioned she might try baking pies if he had dried apples stored somewhere. James directed her to the root cellar without comment, though something warm flickered in his expression at this small claim of domestic territory. The pies emerged golden and fragrant, filling the house with scents of cinnamon and comfort. James ate 3 pieces that evening, declaring them the finest he'd tasted since his mother's kitchen. Catherine's cheeks colored with genuine pleasure, unguarded for once. When he asked if she'd teach him her crust technique, she agreed without the usual hesitation. The next Sunday, James suggested riding to the ridge for the view if weather held. Catherine's immediate refusal came sharp with panic she couldn't quite disguise. He absorbed her reaction without pushing, simply mentioning the invitation stood whenever she felt ready. Then he saddled his horse and rode alone, returning hours later with fresh trout for supper. That night, Catherine lay awake considering the careful architecture of James's patience. He constructed safety not through promises, but through the steady repetition of honorable action. Each day without interrogation, without demands, without violation of the boundaries she'd established. These accumulated into something she hadn't experienced before: genuine security. Perhaps, she thought, trust wasn't given but grown, cultivated through countless small moments where someone proved themselves worthy of it. Chapter 3. shadows surface. November brought early snow and unexpected danger. A traveling merchant arrived at the ranch, his wagon loaded with tinware and fabric. Catherine answered the door, freezing when recognition flashed across the man's weathered face. His greeting carried implications she couldn't ignore. So this is where she'd ended up. Quite the improvement from circumstances she'd left behind. His smile suggested knowledge he hadn't earned the right to possess. Catherine's hands trembled as she called for James, voice barely controlled. James emerged from the barn, reading the situation instantly. Catherine stood rigid in the doorway, face drained of color, while this stranger smirked with calculated malice. Without asking questions, James positioned himself between them, requesting the merchant state his business or leave his property. The man protested, claiming he meant no harm, just surprised to see a familiar face so far from where she'd started. James's response carried quiet steel. His wife's past was her own business, and uninvited guests weren't welcome. The merchant should continue his route elsewhere. After the wagon disappeared down the trail, Catherine stood shaking, expecting the interrogation that surely must follow. Instead, James simply asked if she needed anything, tea, perhaps, or time alone. When she shook her head mutely, he returned to his work, leaving her to process the encounter without pressure. But the incident shattered Catherine's fragile peace. She barely slept that night, starting at every sound. The shadows she'd been outrunning felt closer now, circling with patient malevolence. During breakfast, she pushed food around her plate, unable to meet James's eyes. The following day brought worse. A rider appeared on the ridge at sunset, too far to identify, but close enough to feel threatening. Catherine spotted him from the kitchen window and dropped the plate she was holding. Ceramic shattered across the floor as she backed against the wall, breathing too fast. James heard the crash and found her there, terror naked on her face. He retrieved his rifle calmly, instructed her to lock the bedroom door behind her, and went to investigate. Through the window, Catherine watched him ride toward the distant figure, her heart hammering against her ribs. The rider fled when James approached, disappearing into timber before identification became possible. James returned to find Catherine still pressed against the bedroom door, knuckles white on the handle. He explained what he'd observed, just someone passing through, likely spooked by his approach. But Catherine's fear remained visceral and overwhelming. That night, she couldn't bring herself to sleep. Instead, she huddled in the kitchen, wrapped in a quilt, watching darkness through the window. Near midnight, James emerged from his loft, dressed and alert. Without comment, he stoked the fire and settled into his chair with the rifle across his knees. His message was clear. He would keep watch so she could rest. Catherine wanted to protest, to claim she didn't need protection, but couldn't force the lie past her lips. Instead, she allowed exhaustion to pull her under, trusting James's vigil. Dawn found him still there, eyes tired but alert. Catherine woke to find coffee already made and breakfast cooking. His way of saying the watch had been voluntary, not resentful. When she tried to apologize for causing trouble, he stopped her mid-sentence. Whatever she was running from, whoever might be looking, wasn't her fault. He'd meant every word of his promise. She didn't owe him explanations. But he wanted her to know something important. As long as she remained here, she was under his protection. Anyone who meant her harm would have to go through him first. Catherine absorbed these words, understanding their weight. James wasn't demanding her story. He was choosing her safety regardless of unknown details. The difference mattered more than she could articulate. Chapter 4. The Truth Freely Given. The decision came quietly on a December evening, 3 months after her arrival. Snow fell softly beyond the windows while firelight painted warm shadows across the walls. James read his newspaper. Catherine mended a shirt, both comfortable in familiar silence. Then Catherine set down her needlework and spoke the words that had been building since that first day. She was ready to tell him everything. James lowered his paper immediately, giving her his full attention. She could see him consciously relaxing his posture, making himself approachable rather than intimidating. The care in this small gesture loosened something in her chest. Catherine's story emerged haltingly at first, then with gathering momentum. She'd been married young to a man whose charm masked cruelty. For 3 years, she'd endured escalating violence, believing she had nowhere else to go. When she finally tried leaving, he'd tracked her down, dragging her back with promises that things would change. They never did. The violence worsened. Then one night, defending herself during a particularly brutal attack, she'd struck back. Her husband fell, hitting his head on the fireplace stone. When he didn't rise, Catherine realized he wasn't breathing. Panic had driven her next actions. She'd fled immediately, taking only what she could carry, knowing his influential family would never believe her claims of self-defense. Murder charges would follow. The poor wife who'd killed her devoted husband. So she'd run, changed her name, disappeared into the vast western territories. The mail-order bride advertisement had seemed like salvation. A new identity, a remote location, a chance to vanish completely. She'd expected to play a role, to pretend normalcy while looking over her shoulder forever. Instead, she'd found something unexpected. A man who asked nothing except her presence, who built safety through patient action, who defended her without demanding explanation. Catherine's voice broke as she finished. She waited for judgment, for horror, for the inevitable rejection. Instead, James simply asked one question. Had she been protecting herself? When she nodded, tears finally spilling free, he released a long breath. Then he told her something she desperately needed to hear. What she described wasn't murder, it was survival. The man who hurt her had brought his own end through his actions. Catherine had nothing to be ashamed of. James acknowledged the legal complications, the potential danger if her past caught up with her location. But his position remained unchanged. She was his wife now, under his protection. They would face whatever came together, and anyone seeking to harm her would find themselves severely disappointed by his response. Catherine wept then, not from fear but from overwhelming relief. The secret she'd carried like poison finally released, met not with condemnation but acceptance. James moved to sit beside her, offering his handkerchief without attempting physical comfort she hadn't invited. They talked long into the night, Catherine filling in details she'd held silent for months, James asking occasional clarifying questions but never judging. He shared his own story, a failed engagement to a woman who'd left him for a wealthier prospect, the loneliness that drove him to seek a mail-order bride, his hope for companionship built on mutual respect rather than romantic illusion. By dawn, they'd established new understanding. Catherine's truth changed nothing about their arrangement. She remained welcome, protected, free to build whatever life she chose here. But now they stood on foundation of honesty. The final barrier between them finally dissolved. In following months, their partnership deepened naturally. Catherine's nightmares diminished. Her smiles came easier. The ranch became home rather than hiding place. When James suggested teaching her to ride, she agreed, finding unexpected joy in the freedom of movement across open land. They never returned to her old life. No authorities arrived with accusations. The traveling merchant never reappeared. Whether through luck or the territory's vastness, Catherine's past remained where she'd left it, buried beneath accumulated days of new beginning. Years later, neighbors would comment on the Thornton Ranch's obvious contentment. James and Catherine worked side by side with easy coordination, their conversations flowing naturally, their respect for each other evident in every interaction. When asked about their courtship, James would smile and say simply that Catherine had needed time, and he'd been willing to wait. The truth they'd built together proved stronger than the lies she'd fled. Patience had accomplished what force never could, creating space where trust grew naturally, where healing happened at its own pace, where love emerged not from demanding, but from the steady accumulation of days where safety proved itself real. What started as Catherine's desperate escape became her genuine salvation, though neither she nor James could have predicted the depths of connection that would grow from such careful beginnings. Their story didn't follow the conventional path of whirlwind romance or passionate declarations. Instead, it unfolded slowly, like prairie grass taking root in difficult soil, persistent, steady, and ultimately unshakable. The years that followed brought the natural challenges of frontier life. Harsh winters tested their resources, drought seasons demanded ingenuity, and the isolation of ranch living required genuine compatibility between two people who had started as strangers. But the foundation they'd built, trust earned through patience rather than demanded through authority, proved strong enough to weather every storm. Catherine never forgot the gift James had given her that first day. His promise not to ask until she was ready had been more than simple courtesy. It was a recognition of her humanity, an acknowledgement that her past belonged to her alone, and that her worth wasn't contingent on confession or explanation. In a world that often treated women as property to be interrogated and controlled, James offered revolutionary respect, the right to her own story, shared only when she chose. That respect shaped everything between them. When Catherine eventually suggested they try for children, it was her decision freely made, not his expectation imposed. When she wanted to learn ranch management skills traditionally reserved for men, James taught her without condescension. When neighbors whispered about the mysterious bride who'd appeared from nowhere, James shut down gossip with quiet firmness that left no room for speculation. Their ranch became known throughout the territory not just for its well-managed livestock and productive fields, but for the obvious partnership at its heart. Young couples starting their own homesteads would sometimes seek their advice, and James always offered the same wisdom. Rushing trust destroys it, while patience allows it to grow strong. Catherine lived the rest of her years without looking over her shoulder, the shadows of her past finally losing their power. She'd found something more valuable than escape. She'd found genuine sanctuary, not in hiding, but in being fully known and still completely accepted. The mail-order bride who'd arrived carrying nothing but secrets and fear became a woman who walked freely across land she helped build, beside a man who'd proven that real strength lies not in demanding answers, but in offering safety while someone finds their voice. If this story of finding healing through patience touched your heart, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments which moment moved you most. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.